The sun was setting over Los Angeles, casting an eerie orange glow across the city. But this wasn't a peaceful sunset. In the distance, thick black smoke rose into the sky, blocking out the sun. The flames spread quickly, burning everything in their way. The city was on fire, and no one could stop it. Sirens screamed through the streets, and loudspeakers shouted warnings to evacuate. But it was already too late. The fire was moving faster than anyone could run. People rushed to their cars, desperate to escape, but many were already trapped. The streets emptied in minutes, leaving nothing but the roar of the flames. But as the city fled, one question hung in the air. Who was left behind? Not everyone had the chance to leave. The elderly, the sick, the forgotten. In a city of millions, some are invisible. And in the midst of the fire, Isabel stood alone. Isabel was kind, but she was also old, blind, and deaf. She sat in her small, dark living room, unaware of the world burning around her. She couldn't hear the alarms or see the smoke creeping closer. She had no idea that the fire was coming for her. Imagine being trapped in your own home, unable to hear the danger or see the destruction. How would you know if it was too late to escape? Isabel's heart raced as the heat grew stronger. She couldn't hear the panic outside, but something told her the end was near. The fire was coming. The question everyone asked was, who would? Be left behind in the flames? What if the answer was Isabel? In the heart of the chaos, Isabel sat motionless in her favorite armchair, a room lit only by the fading sunlight from outside. To the world, she was an invisible soul. Blind and deaf, Isabel's connection to the world had slowly faded over the years. The alarms, the warnings, the sirens, they were nothing more than distant echoes, lost to her forever. The flames that were tearing apart the city outside were a silent, invisible force in her life, as if they were someone else's nightmare. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the quilt draped over her lap. But the world felt oddly still. It wasn't the calm before the storm. No, it was the strange kind of silence that only someone who couldn't see or hear could understand. The kind of silence where everything feels muted, even the urgency of a city on fire. Isabel had lived a long, fulfilling life. She had raised her children with love and care, had helped animals when they needed her most, and had always found time to give to others. She was a kind soul, known for her generosity, but now, all of that kindness seemed to have faded into the distance. Her sons were far away, and her husband had passed long ago. Alone, in this moment, Isabel was trapped in her silence. But why? Why hadn't she left? The city was emptying, and everyone was fleeing for their lives, scrambling to escape the fire that was consuming everything in its path. But Isabel couldn't hear the rush of cars, the clamor of people, or the desperate calls for help. The world had left her behind without a second thought, it seemed. Or had they? Were they even aware that Isabel was still here, in the house, unaware of what was coming? The question echoed through the silence of the room. Could someone truly be left behind in a moment like this, when the city is burning and the world is fleeing? How could one woman be overlooked? Was Isabel really alone, or was there something more to this silence that we couldn't yet see? The fire outside was creeping closer. Isabel sat, unaware of the world crumbling around her, and just as the flames drew nearer, one thing was certain: she would not remain invisible for long. Isabel's life had always been one of quiet, unwavering kindness. Long before her world grew silent, she had spent her days caring for the creatures that needed her most. From nursing injured wildlife back to health to comforting animals that had nowhere else to go, Isabel had devoted herself to protecting the fragile lives that crossed her path. Her compassion spread like the roots of an old oak tree, touching everyone who met her. In her younger years, Isabel had worked with local wildlife organizations, spending countless hours in the wild, tending to injured birds and comforting orphaned deer. She'd always found peace in the forest, surrounded by nature where the world was simpler and the animals' gratitude spoke louder than any words could. People admired her for her selflessness, often saying, "Isabel's heart is as vast as the open skies." Her reputation as a kind and caring soul was known by all who met her, yet now all of that seemed to vanish into the air with the smoke. Now, in her final years, Isabel was alone. Her children had grown up and moved away, her husband had passed, and her closest friends had long since gone. The woman who had always offered comfort to others was left in solitude, alone in her small house, surrounded by the echoes of a life filled with purpose. But now, in the midst of the wildfire, as the city crumbled and everyone rushed to save themselves, Isabel sat in her quiet house, unaware of the world burning around her. The silence was so deafening, so complete, that it was almost as if the world had forgotten the woman who had spent her life giving everything to others. The question that lingered like smoke in the air was simple yet haunting. Why was someone who had given so much to the world now left to face this catastrophe alone? Was it fair? Was it right for someone so full of compassion, who had always been there for others, to find herself abandoned in her final years? In a world where kindness had once been her guiding light, why was she now left to face the dark alone? And as the fire continued to spread, Isabel's fate seemed uncertain. The woman who had saved so many was now caught in a cruel twist of fate. Would her life of kindness be enough to save her when she needed it most? Isabel's son, Michael, lived in another state, far away from the chaos-consuming Los Angeles. He had always been close to his mother, the one who had raised him with endless love and support. But now, his life was miles away, in a busy city where the only thing on his mind was his job. The city of Los Angeles had always been far from his thoughts, until the day the alarm sounded. As the wildfire ravaged the city, Michael sat in his office, completely unaware of the danger that loomed over his mother. He glanced at his phone, but there was no sign of a message from her. Isabel had always been independent, never the type to reach out unless it was important. Maybe she was fine, he thought. Maybe she hadn't heard about the fire or wasn't in its path. But as the hours passed, Michael's unease began to grow. His phone buzzed with messages from friends and family, all asking if he had heard the news. Fires were burning out of control in Los Angeles, and people were fleeing the city in droves. But what about his mother? Was she safe? With panic rising in his chest, Michael tried to reach her, dialing her number over and over, but the line was dead. The cell towers were down, and the city's infrastructure was collapsing under the pressure of the fire. He couldn't get through. The distance between them, once something he'd taken for granted, now felt like an endless chasm. How could he help her from so far away? How could he get to her when he was trapped in another state, unable to cross the miles fast enough to reach her? Time was running out. The fire was moving fast, and Isabel was alone. Was he too late? Would he ever make it to her in time to save her from the flames? Or was this a cruel reminder of how helpless distance could make you feel when it mattered most? Could the love between mother and son overcome the vast separation between them? Or would this distance be the one thing that kept him from reaching her before the fire consumed everything? Now, let me take you to the past, a few years ago. It was just another day for Isabel, returning home after a long shift at the wildlife hospital. She was used to seeing the occasional injured animal along the roadside, but today something felt different. As she drove down a quiet, rural path, her eyes, though limited by her blindness, felt a strange sense of urgency in the air. When she heard the soft whinnying, she slowed the van and parked. There, on the edge of the road, was a mare. The animal collapsed, her body trembling, sweat pouring from her flanks. Isabel's heart raced as she carefully stepped out of the van, using the sound of the wind and the rustling of the trees to guide her toward the mare, and then, through the faintest whisper of breath, Isabel felt it. The mare had just given birth. She could sense the tiny hoofbeats of a newborn foal nearby. The foal was weak, standing on trembling legs, the life still fresh in its veins but too fragile to move. Isabel's heart sank as she crouched by the mare. The mare, too, was in terrible shape. Her breathing shallow, eyes glossed over in pain, as if she knew her time was running out. The mare turned her head slowly, locking eyes with Isabel, as if she was asking for help. Tears glistened in the animal's eyes. In that moment, Isabel felt an overwhelming sense of connection. She reached out, gently stroking the mare's neck, and murmured soft words of comfort. But Isabel knew the reality. The mare was dying, and the foal, without help, it wouldn't survive either. Torn between the desperate need to save the foal and the urgency of getting the mare to safety, Isabel made a choice that would change her life forever. She gently lifted the young foal, cradling it in her arms as best as she could. The mare's eyes followed them, her final act of trust. With every ounce of her strength, Isabel guided the foal toward the van. But as she did, she could feel the mare's energy slipping away. The journey to the wildlife hospital was short, but in that brief time, the mare passed away. Isabel's heart broke for the creature, the bond formed in such a short span of time. She had tried, she had cared. But was it enough? Would the foal survive without its mother? And what would happen to this fragile young life now that the mare was gone? The foal, soon to be named Robbin, would live. But Isabel's choice that day, though a simple act of compassion, had created a bond between them that neither of them could have anticipated. Would Robbin remember the kindness of the woman who had tried to save him? Would their paths cross again, years later, in a time when Isabel needed help the most? The sun was beginning to set as Isabel drove home from her wildlife job, her mind busy with the day's work. She had seen countless animals in need, but today, something was different. As she turned a bend in the road, she caught sight of a mare lying in the grass, her body trembling with exhaustion. The air was heavy with the scent of fresh blood, and Isabel's heart sank. The mare was in distress, her sides heaving as she tried to push herself up, but there was something more. A soft whimper, a desperate whinny that pierced the silence. Isabel's instincts kicked in. She parked her van quickly, her hands shaking as she moved to get out. The air was thick with the sounds of pain, the mare's cries echoing in the distance. When Isabel reached the mare's side, she could sense the gravity of the situation. The mare's eyes were wide, full of fear, and she had just given birth. The tiny foal was lying nearby, struggling to stand, its legs unsteady. Isabel's heart ached as she knelt beside the mare, feeling the heat of her body, her hooves twitching in agony. The mare's tear-filled eyes met Isabel's, and in that instant Isabel understood. She had to help. Without hesitation, Isabel gently moved the foal closer, trying to cradle it in her arms as she whispered soothing words. She looked back at the mare, who was still watching her, her eyes pleading for help. The mare had given her trust, asking Isabel to take care of her baby. As Isabel gathered the foal into her arms, she made a silent promise to the mare. "I will take care of him," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I won't let him suffer." But time was running out. The mare was slipping away, her body no longer able to fight the pain. Isabel knew she had to act quickly. She rushed to the van, carefully placing the foal inside, but as she did, the mare's breathing slowed, her head falling to the ground. It was too late. Isabel had failed to save the mare, but she had made a promise that she would keep, no matter the cost. She would ensure the foal was safe, and she would care for him as if he were her own. As she drove towards the wildlife hospital, Isabel could feel the weight of the mare's final gaze. She had made a promise, and now she had to live up to it. Would the foal survive without its mother? Would Isabel be able to honor her promise in a world full of uncertainty? The foal, Robbin, was now in Isabel's care. And though the mare had passed away, Isabel's promise would remain. She would keep her word, no matter what. The van sped down the dirt road, the sound of the engine roaring in Isabel's ears. But all she could hear were the desperate whinnies of the mare and the faint, shaky breaths she took. The foal, nestled quietly in the back of the van, was unaware of the heavy moment unfolding. Isabel's hands gripped the steering wheel, but her mind was elsewhere, focused on the mare. The mare's condition was worsening by the minute. Her breathing was shallow, each gasping breath pulling her body closer to the brink of death. Isabel's heart was racing, her eyes darting nervously between the road and the mare, who was now lying across the back seat of the van. Then, as if hearing her silent cries for help, the mare's labored breathing faltered. A soft, almost inaudible whinny escaped her lips. Isabel pulled the van over quickly, her heart sinking. The mare had spoken, whispering with what little strength she had left. "Please, take care of him." The mare's voice was faint but urgent. Isabel froze, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't just a cry for help, it was a plea. The mare wasn't just asking for the foal's survival, she was entrusting Isabel with her most precious possession. Isabel's hands trembled as she reached out, brushing the mare's damp coat. "I will," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I promise. I will take care of him." The mare's eyes flickered, locking on to Isabel's gaze one final time. The pain was gone now. Her body, exhausted from the birth, was giving up. The mare's final act was one of total trust, and Isabel, despite the overwhelming sorrow, vowed to keep her word. "I'll keep him safe," Isabel repeated, more to herself than to the mare. The animal's head dropped gently, her last breath escaping into the still air of the van. A heavy silence hung in the air. Isabel could feel the weight of the mare's final wish in the pit of her stomach. It was a promise, an unspoken bond that transcended words, one that connected them in those final moments of life. As Isabel continued driving toward the wildlife hospital, a tear slid down her cheek. She wasn't sure what would happen next, or if the foal would survive the trauma of losing its mother. But one thing was certain. Isabel would do everything in her power to honor the mare's last words. Could kindness truly transcend even death? Isabel didn't know. But as the foal stirred beside her, she knew she couldn't break the promise she had made. No matter the obstacles, no matter the pain, she would fulfill it. And in doing so, she would protect the young foal as though it were her own. The van hummed along the quiet road, its engine the only sound breaking the eerie silence. Isabel's heart was pounding in her chest, her hands gripping the wheel with a determination that was starting to waver. The mare, once strong and full of life, now lay lifeless in the back of the van. Isabel's eyes flickered to the rearview mirror, her mind struggling to come to terms with what had just happened. The mare, the one she had promised to protect, was gone. In the brief moments before the mare had passed, Isabel had felt the weight of her promise. But now, that promise was a haunting reminder of what she had lost. The foal, still trembling from the ordeal, whinnied softly from the back of the van. It was too young to understand the tragedy, but it could sense the absence of its mother. The small creature huddled in the corner, its wide eyes filled with fear. Isabel pulled the van over to the side of the road, the heavy feeling in her chest threatening to crush her. The air was thick with the scent of smoke from distant wildfires, and the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the empty road. She sat there for a moment, her breath catching in her throat. The mare was gone, and she had failed her. All she had now was the foal, a helpless baby left with no mother to care for it. What would she do now? The weight of the question pressed on Isabel's mind as the world outside seemed to close in on her. Could she save the foal? She wasn't a vet, nor was she prepared for the emotional toll of losing the mare. But the foal was counting on her. Its life, fragile and uncertain, depended on Isabel's ability to step up in the face of unimaginable loss. Tears welled up in her eyes as she turned to look at the foal. It was so small, so vulnerable, and yet there was a spark in its eyes, a spark that reminded her of the strength that animals, like people, could find in the darkest of times. She opened the back of the van carefully, her movements slow and deliberate. The foal shuffled towards her, its tiny legs wobbling beneath it. Isabel reached out, placing a gentle hand on its soft coat. "I promised her," she whispered through gritted teeth, her voice trembling with emotion. "I'll keep my word. You're not alone." But how much could one person handle? How much could she endure before it all became too much? The answer was unclear, but Isabel knew one thing for sure. She couldn't give up now. Not for herself, not for the foal, and certainly not for the mare who had trusted her with its life. As she drove on, the weight of loss settled heavily in her chest, but so did the glimmer of hope. The foal's survival was now in her hands. It was a heavy responsibility, one that would take everything she had, but she was determined to see it through. In the quiet of the van, Isabel made a silent promise, not just to the mare, but to the foal, too. No matter how hard the road ahead might be, she would carry this burden. Because sometimes, the most profound strength comes from having nothing left to lose. Isabel watched as the tiny foal, now named Robbin, took its first wobbly steps at the animal hospital. She could feel a mix of sadness and hope rise in her chest. She had done everything she could, but now it was out of her hands. Robbin's journey was just beginning, and though she wouldn't be with him for the rest of it, she had left an indelible mark on his life. The first few weeks at the zoo were tough for Robbin. He was placed in a small enclosure with other young animals, but his wide eyes often seemed to reflect a deep sadness, as if he knew something important was missing. The zookeepers did everything they could, but the loneliness lingered in his heart. As the months passed, Robbin began to grow stronger. His legs grew long and powerful, and his coat became sleek and shiny. He was no longer the fragile foal Isabel had cared for. He was becoming a magnificent horse, with a coat the color of golden sun and eyes that held a deep wisdom. But something was different about him. The bond he had with Isabel, though fleeting, had somehow remained within him. As Robbin's strength grew, so did his connection to Isabel. When he would hear the faint sound of a human voice near his enclosure, he would stop whatever he was doing, his ears perking up, as if listening for something or someone he recognized. The zookeepers noticed this strange behavior, but they couldn't quite understand it. They had never seen an animal behave this way. Robbin was special, they knew that much. But how could they explain the bond between him and the kind woman who had once saved him? Isabel's life had moved on. Years had passed since the fire, and the world around her had changed. The zoo was a distant memory, but Robbin's image stayed with her. She often wondered how he was doing, whether he had adjusted to life without the mare, whether he remembered the promise she had made to protect him. One day, as Isabel was sitting in her small house, the sound of an approaching fire truck shattered the silence. She thought little of it at first, but then something stopped her. Her heart raced as a memory flashed in her mind. The scent of smoke, the flicker of flames, the echo of a whinny in the air. It was all too familiar. She stood up quickly, the weight of years pressing down on her tired legs. Something was pulling her outside. She couldn't explain it, but she knew she had to see. As she walked to the front window, her fingers brushing the wooden frame, she saw something unexpected, an animal standing in the street. The figure was tall, powerful, and moving with an unmistakable grace. It was Robbin. Her heart skipped a beat as she watched him stand there, his head held high. The fire was getting closer, but Robbin wasn't running. He was standing still, looking in her direction with eyes full of recognition. Isabel's breath caught in her throat. Could it be? After all these years, could it really be him? Robbin slowly began to move toward her house, and with each step, Isabel felt her heart race faster. Could this be the reunion she had never thought possible? The foal she had saved, the one she had promised to protect, was here, alive, and finding his way back to her. But why now? Was it a memory of kindness, a bond that refused to be forgotten? As Robbin neared, Isabel opened the door with trembling hands. The fire was spreading, but in that moment, she could feel nothing but a deep sense of gratitude and awe. The past, the promises, and the love they had shared seemed to converge in a single, perfect moment. The foal had grown into something magnificent, and now he was returning the favor. "Robbin," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the wind. "You came back." And in that moment, the years, the losses, and the hardships seemed to fade away. The bond they shared was not just a memory. It was a promise that had been kept. The fire may have taken everything else, but it could never burn the kindness that had brought them together. Time had been both a friend and a foe to Isabel. As the years passed, so too did the people she had loved most. Her husband, once her rock, was gone. Her sons, each with their own life paths, had left her one by one. First, the youngest, then the middle son. The final blow came when her husband passed, and Isabel was left alone in the home they had once shared. Alone, blind, and deaf, Isabel found herself in the quietest of silences. The world outside her small house continued to change at a relentless pace. The city, once a place of bustling activity, had been rebuilt after the fire. People moved on, the pain of the past fading with each passing day. The zoo where Robbin had lived had since been forgotten, replaced by new attractions. People continued. Their lives, and Isabel, trapped in the labyrinth of her memories, could only imagine the world beyond her doorstep. Yet, as the years grew longer, one question lingered in Isabel's heart. Would she ever feel the warmth of those she had lost? The memories of her sons, her husband, and even the foal she had saved remained etched in her mind, though time had dulled their voices. The touch of her family's love seemed like a distant dream. The thought that they might never return to her left a cold weight on her heart. Would Isabel ever hear the voices of her loved ones again, or would she spend her final years alone, a shadow of the woman she had once been? What do we do when the world around us moves forward, but we're stuck in the past? When we feel like we've lost everything, our family, our health, and our connection to the world, how do we find the strength to keep going? Can time ever truly heal the wounds we carry, or does it simply teach us how to live with them? Isabel couldn't answer these questions. She could only sit in the silence, hoping that perhaps somewhere out there her family still remembered her, and if not, maybe one day something unexpected would come to remind her that she had never truly been forgotten. Isabel's world had shrunk to the four walls of her small home. The once bustling, lively house now echoed with nothing but the faint sounds of the wind outside. Her vision, once clear and sharp, was nothing but a blur of shadows and fading shapes. Her hearing, once so attentive to the little things, now silenced the whispers of the world. In the absence of her family, Isabel's days stretched on, each one blending into the next. She survived not because of joy or purpose, but because she simply did not know how to stop. The house, once filled with laughter, warmth, and the comforting presence of those she loved, now felt like a cold shell. Each room seemed to close in on her as time passed, and Isabel was left to wander through the memories of a life she once knew, unable to connect with the outside world. How did she cope with this unbearable silence? The ache of her empty home and the absence of her family gnawed at her heart. Each day, Isabel sat by the window, feeling the pull of the outside world, but unable to see or hear it. Would she survive the crushing weight of loneliness? Would anyone ever come to check on her, or would she fade into the shadows of the forgotten? The loneliness was unlike any physical pain she had ever known. It was a deep, suffocating emptiness that felt like it could swallow her whole. There were no comforting voices, no visits from the past. Isabel had lost so much: her sons, her husband, the animals she had cared for. It was as if everything she had given love to had simply slipped away. Was there any hope for her? Could she find a way to endure this endless solitude? Is loneliness the cruelest of all human experiences? Does it hurt more than physical pain or even grief? When everything and everyone is gone, when you're left in silence, can you still find a reason to live? Isabel's situation is one that many may face in their own lives: the loss of loved ones, the passing of time, and the sense of being forgotten. But how do we continue when we feel like no one is left to care? The answer may lie in the deepest corners of the heart. The belief that even in our loneliest moments, something unexpected might emerge to remind us we're not truly alone. The winds howled, carrying with them the acrid scent of smoke. From a distance, the fire had been a rumble, a mere whisper on the horizon. But now, it was closer, much closer. The flames stretched higher into the sky, towering over the city, reaching for the heavens. Los Angeles, the city that had once felt so invincible, was now at the mercy of the fire. Isabel sat quietly, unaware of the growing danger. Her life had become a series of quiet moments, each one more still than the last. The world outside her home had begun to blur, and the noises of the fire, the distant sirens, the rush of people fleeing were unheard to her. To her, it was just another ordinary day. But for how long? The fire was coming. It didn't care if she was blind, deaf, or alone. It didn't care about the memories she held or the kindness she had once shown. The flames were relentless, and they would devour everything in their path. Isabel had no way of knowing it, but she was trapped in a race against time where the fire didn't care about her circumstances. Would she even survive long enough to see someone come for her? Could she escape the flames that had already consumed so much of the city? What would you do if you had no way to hear or see the dangers around you? Would you be able to sense the imminent threat? How would you cope when your senses have failed you and the world outside is rushing to destroy everything in its path? After months of working in another state, Isabel's son, Marco, had finally booked a flight home. He had no idea that the city he once knew had turned into a war zone, and he certainly couldn't have imagined the chaos awaiting him. As the plane descended over the smoldering city, Marco felt a sinking in his chest. Something was wrong. The once familiar streets were covered in smoke, the buildings looking like distant ghosts in the haze. He rushed to his car, heart pounding. The messages, the news, none of it had prepared him for the reality he was about to face. Isabel was still at home, alone. Marco had been too far away, too isolated in his own life, to know the fire was coming. Would he make it back in time to save his mother from the inferno that was threatening to swallow the city whole? As Marco fought his way through the smoke and chaos, his thoughts kept racing. Was he too late? Could he find her? Was she even alive? What would it feel like to come home and find everything changed? To return to a place you once knew only To realize it's no longer the home you remember? How far would you go to save the ones you love when the world around you is falling apart? Robbin, the horse that Isabel had once cared for, now lived in a zoo, surrounded by other animals. But the fire was relentless. It spread faster than anyone had anticipated, licking at the zoo's fences and tearing through the animal enclosures. Animals that had been confined for years were now freed by the flames, some escaping into the wild, others simply running in fear. Robbin, too, was swept up in the chaos. The once tranquil zoo became a battleground as the fire consumed everything in its path. Robbin, who had spent his entire life in captivity, had no choice but to run, driven by the instinct to survive. The horse, who had once been so closely tied to Isabel, was now caught in the same storm that threatened to take everything from both of them. Would Robbin survive the fire that was now consuming the zoo? Could he find his way through the destruction and back to Isabel, the woman who had shown him kindness so long ago? The fire wasn't just a threat to Isabel anymore. It was taking everything, including the animals she had once saved. Would Robbin, with his deep instinctual bond to her, be able to return to the one person who had made a difference in his life? What drives animals to escape their cages in moments of chaos? Is it the will to survive, or the memory of something, someone they once trusted? Could Robbin's journey lead him back to Isabel? And if so, what would that reunion mean for them both? The smoke burned Robbin's nostrils as he galloped through the chaos. The zoo, now in ruins, had become a fiery nightmare. But one thing remained, clear in his mind: Isabel. He remembered the kindness she had shown him when he was just a foal, alone and vulnerable. The gentle touch of her hands, the way she whispered comfort to him. These memories burned brighter than the fire surrounding him. Driven by the need to return to the one person who had saved his life, Robbin pushed forward, weaving through the flames, his heart pounding in his chest. Every muscle in his body screamed for relief, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't fail her. He had to find her. As Robbin raced toward Isabel's house, the fire roared louder, its flames growing fiercer by the second. Would he reach her in time to rescue her from the inferno that was swallowing everything in its path? Could a horse, guided by instinct and memories of kindness, truly defy the odds? Can a simple act of kindness change the course of fate? Would the bond Isabel had formed with Robbin in the past be enough to guide him through the flames, leading him back to her in her most desperate hour? Robbin finally reached the outskirts of Isabel's neighborhood, only to find her house already surrounded by flames. The once cozy home was now nothing more than a silhouette against the inferno that had taken over the city. There was no sign of Isabel, no sign of escape, just the crackling of burning wood and the roar of the fire. Robbin hesitated for a moment, his heart heavy with the realization that time was running out. He could feel the heat, the intensity of the fire trying to push him back, but all he could think of was Isabel, her face, her gentle spirit, and the promise he had made to her long ago. Could Robbin make it through the walls of fire? Was there even a way to reach Isabel before the house collapsed into ash? He had been through so much to get here, but would it be enough? How much would you risk to save someone who once saved you? What would you do if your world had been turned upside down by flames, and the only thing that mattered was rescuing the one person who showed you love and compassion when you needed it most? Robbin didn't hesitate. With one final burst of energy, he charged toward the burning house, the heat licking at his coat, but his resolve stronger than ever. His hooves pounded against the ground as he leapt through the smoke and flames, his mind focused solely on the one goal: to save Isabel. The fire tore at him, its embers burning his skin, but he pressed on, ignoring the pain, ignoring the overwhelming heat. He could hear nothing but the roar of the flames, but he knew he was getting closer. Isabel was in there. Isabel needed him. With each passing second, the fire seemed to grow fiercer. The house was nearly consumed, and every step Robbin took toward Isabel was a step closer to certain danger. Could he reach her in time? Would his courage be enough to overcome the flames? Or would the fire take them both? How far would you go for someone who cared for you in your darkest hour? Would you risk everything to return the kindness that was shown to you, even when the odds are stacked against you? Would you fight the fire, the pain, and the overwhelming fear to keep a promise made so long ago? Robbin's body trembled with exhaustion, but he refused to stop. His hooves scraped against the charred earth as he pushed past the fire, his breath labored and shallow. Finally, there she was, Isabel, still sitting on the floor, oblivious to the danger, too weak to escape. He lowered his head, nudging her, gently with his nose. She barely reacted, lost in the haze of her senses. With a grunt of determination, Robbin took action. He used every ounce of his strength to nudge a wooden plank beneath Isabel's frail body, and with a powerful heave, he lifted her. His hooves scraped across the embers, but nothing would stop him. He moved forward inch by inch, carefully carrying Isabel away from the fire that threatened to consume them both. The fire crackled around them, threatening to close in at any moment. Could Robbin make it to safety in time? Was the strength of their bond enough to survive the raging inferno? What does it feel like to be saved by a creature you once helped? Can a promise made long ago truly save us from the darkest moments of our lives? Will Isabel and Robbin find the safety they so desperately need? Or is the fire still too powerful to escape? Isabel sat in the quiet aftermath, her body bruised and battered, but alive. Robbin stood beside her, the last traces of smoke billowing from his mane. She reached out, trembling, and gently cupped his face in her hands. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she whispered, "You saved me." In that moment, as their eyes met, the bond between them felt unbreakable. Isabel knew that no amount of disaster, no fire, no loss could ever break the connection they shared. Robbin had given her a second chance at life, just as she had once done for him. Their reunion was a miracle in the truest sense. Could Isabel truly heal from the trauma of the fire? Could she rebuild her life after everything had been taken from her? Would their bond continue to grow? Or would time and circumstances tear them apart? How does love and kindness survive even the worst disasters? Can the bond between a human and an animal endure the darkest moments? Or does life eventually wear it down? What happens when two souls who once saved each other are finally reunited? As the days turned into weeks, Isabel and Robbin found peace in each other's company. The world around them may have been ravaged by fire, but they had found their own quiet sanctuary. Together, they formed a new family, one forged in the flames of hardship and survival. Isabel, once surrounded by family and now alone, found solace in Robbin's presence. And Robbin, who had once been a vulnerable foal, now stood strong beside the woman who had never given up on him. Their bond had not only survived the fire, it had grown stronger. They were no longer two separate lives. They were family. Would their bond last? Could the trauma of the fire and the scars left by the disaster be healed over time? Or would fate have other plans for them, pulling them apart when they least expected it? What can we learn from the unexpected heroes who save us when we least expect it? How do acts of kindness ripple through time, changing lives and forming unbreakable bonds? Can two souls find strength in each other and rebuild no matter the obstacles in their way?